Good morning, everyone. You are very welcome to the Psychological First Aid Advice for Services Supporting People Migrating Due to War. The panel would be delighted to receive any questions you may have during the event. Please use the Q&A feature located at the bottom of your PC laptop screen. If you are using an iPad, you will find this feature located at the top of your screen. Without further ado, I will now hand you over to Clare Gormley, Director of HSC Galway Roscommon Psychological Services. Thank you.
Hello everyone and welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today for this workshop, which has been prepared by Will Mowlds and myself. Will is our expert in the Community Healthcare West in terms of his work with social inclusion and the reception centre for refugees at Ballyhadureen. So we hope that today will be useful. We have a lot of people from a lot of different services here, and we hope it will be useful and beneficial for the work that you're doing in terms of helping both the Ukrainian population now and also other groups as we proceed. So I'm just going to share my screen now, and once we get that going, we'll just go from the beginning and we'll start to take you into the workshop per se. So as I say, I've introduced myself and Will. I'm the Director of Psychology for Galway and Roscommon. And as we say, we hope that we have got good advice here today for all services supporting people who've been migrating due to war. So just by way of introduction then, today these are practical recommendations to support people who are forced to migrate, also how to look after yourself and your fellow workers, and to know where to get further help and resources. And these guidelines draw from experiences of other countries in terms of supporting people fleeing from war and persecution, as well as research and guidelines from a range of experts. I'm just going to see here if I can maybe minimize a little bit here on this box at the side. Nope, that's okay. Let me just try to move it a little bit. Thanks. Okay, so just moving along. In terms of our learning outcomes today, the focus is going to be in different sections. We're going to look at understanding the needs of people fleeing war and persecution. Then Will is going to talk again about the psychological impact of war and persecution and displacement. After that, I'm going to speak about knowing what we can do to support others in terms of psychological first aid principles and understanding how to look after yourself in a crisis with evidence-based self-care. And finally, we're going to finish by knowing where to access supports and reliable resources. So throughout the workshop today, we're going to refer to a word called psychosocial. And for a lot of people, this isn't a word we're normally using. So what does it actually mean? So psychosocial refers to your basic needs for someone's emotional and psychological well-being. So in terms of a psychosocial crisis, what we've learned, if you can imagine a situation where you have a serious road traffic accident or something of that nature, in the very early phases, you're going to see the practical needs for people is going to be really important, and the medical needs for people are going to be really important at the start. But let's say you've been in a car accident and you've broken a leg or something. Eventually, after the acute phase, you'll be recovering physically from it. But the psychological needs in relation to that accident or major event may continue for a lot longer period. There's a much longer term period in terms of psychological needs. And so what we're really looking at here is as people are coming into the country and their initial needs are going to be their practical needs and their medical needs in the first instance, as well as to a degree their psychological needs, we're expecting that their psychological and psychosocial needs will continue for a much longer period, possibly a couple of years for many people. So just in terms of who gets affected by a crisis, what is the psychosocial impact of a crisis and how big is that? How does that impact on different individuals? What we know from research is that everyone can be affected by a crisis in some ways. But the degree to which people are affected from the research is definitely related to the following. So it's related to how close the crisis is to us, how much or how long we're exposed to the crisis, our view of the level of risk for ourselves, safety for ourselves or for others, whether we feel we've some control or not, and if there's isolation from social supports, the normal social supports, family and friends and so on. And finally, and an important point is our own individual coping abilities, given our own personal characteristics, our life experiences, and the quality of supports that we have. So all of these factors will significantly affect the degree to which any individual is affected by a crisis. And many of those things are things that we don't have a lot of control over. So before I introduce Will, I just want to come to this short exercise. And this is just really, there may be things that in this 60-minute workshop might just trigger off some feelings in yourselves and so on. We're talking about a very complex and difficult situation. So just in order to kind of obtain a technique that's going to be helpful, that you can use anytime, anywhere. You can stand up and do it, or you can sit down. We'll keep you sitting for the moment, but it's just called tension down. And essentially what we're going to do is we're just going to sit upright and just inhale through the nose and notice any tension in our bodies. And then we're going to exhale out through the mouth, relieving all the breath, and allow that tension, imagine that tension flowing down through the body, leaving you feeling more relaxed and comfortable. So we'll do it twice just to give you the feeling of it now. So just sitting firmly with your feet firmly on the floor, your back straight, just inhale through the nose slowly. Notice any tension in your body as you do that. And exhale out through the mouth. Imagine that tension, say tension down, and imagine that tension flowing down through your body, through the floor and far away. So just to repeat that. You can say tension down out loud if you're in a room on your own, or if you're in a room with lots of other people, you can always use it, but say it into yourself. So just inhaling through the nose again. Notice the tension in your body anywhere that it is. And then as you exhale, say tension down, and notice that tension moving down through your body, through the floor and far away, leaving you feeling just that little bit calmer and more refreshed. You can do that anytime you like. Obviously, if you're driving somewhere, don't close your eyes. But other than that, you can do it for the few seconds that it takes and repeat it as often as you wish at different points in the day. So without more ado, I'm going to hand you over to Will, and he's going to take you through the first couple of sections of the programme. So thanks, Will.
So thank you, Claire. Thank you for the introduction and for that relaxation exercise as well. So I'm just going to share my slides now. I think, Claire, you just need, super. Okay. So to continue from where we started, I'm gonna firstly discuss the general needs of those who are fleeing war, conflict, and persecution. And then I'm going to move on to talk more specifically about how those kind of situations can impact people and those that we may encounter, such as those who have arrived in Ireland who are fleeing the conflict in Ukraine. So it's important, I think, to know some of the terminology in this area. I've been working in this area for a few years now, and I do recall being a little bit confused by some of the terms. So just to know that a refugee is someone who has fled their country of origin because of persecution, conflict, violence, or other circumstances that require international protection. So Ireland already hosts quite a number of refugees from Syria, Afghanistan, and now Ukraine, but also from all parts of the world as well. Whereas an applicant for international protection is the preferred term now across the EU for what we would have called an asylum seeker. So that's someone who has come here seeking protection, and many will live across our various direct provision settings across the state. And then finally, it's important to know what an unaccompanied minor here. That's basically a young person under the age of 18 who has also arrived here seeking protection, but is here without a parent, a guardian, or a carer. Okay, so it's useful to think about the phases that a refugee experiences whenever they need to leave their country because of war or persecution. And it is a very complicated journey, but it can help us to think about it by breaking it down into 3 distinct phases. And that is pre-migration, flight, survival, and adjustment. And so I'll talk about each one of them in turn now. So firstly, if we think about pre-migration, so this is the time before and whilst either the conflict or the war starts and the persecution begins. And by persecution, this could be on political grounds, on religious grounds, or on grounds of sexual orientation or gender. And during this phase, if you think about it, individuals or families know that something dangerous might be coming, their lives may be at risk, and they need to decide what are they going to do to avoid it. And that's a big decision for an individual or a family to make. Do I stay where I am? Do I stay in my home, or do I need to leave? So for many refugees, this phase can last a long time. And during this phase, there can be lots of social upheaval. It can lead to a lot of chaos. Society can break down, which in turn can lead to disease, poverty, shortages of food, poor living conditions, and health problems. Whereas for other refugees, this phase can be rather quick. And during this phase, individuals and families can face multiple threats to themselves, to their family. They can experience multiple losses and bereavements. And I've just included some headlines now that would have been in the media around the time before the Ukrainian war commenced. And again, sometimes it'd be mixed messaging within the media, and it's just to get a sense of how difficult it would be to make that decision of whether to stay or whether to go. So again, I'm particularly thinking about young people during this phase. There might be limited access to education, and this can impact on social development within young people as well. And during this phase, individuals, families, and children can be directly or indirectly exposed to persecution or war-related trauma. So this might be war conflict, physical violence, sexual violence, torture, witnessing killing, the torture of loved ones, or imprisonment. So there's multiple traumas can occur at this stage. So now we need to think about the phase of flight, which is when individuals of families will move from their country of origin to a safer country. And for some individuals and families, this can be a relatively straightforward journey. So for example, many of the individuals who now reside in Ireland from Afghanistan flew here directly and arrived here by airplane. Whereas other individuals and families, for example, many of the families that are here from Syria would have had multiple journeys. So for example, many of the families here from Syria may have been displaced within Syria first, and then may have walked across the border to Lebanon or Turkey, and then from there faced a long journey, perhaps to Greece, perhaps living in a refugee camp before arriving in Ireland. So it can be quite varied. And across this phase of flight then, there are many challenges that individuals and families can face. And again, such as physical violence, sexual violence, threats to safety, people can be separated from their family. There can be a lot of poverty, particularly living in camps, perhaps in countries with less resources. Again, it can involve traveling through multiple countries, as I mentioned. Some of the living conditions in refugee camps can be quite dangerous. And again, this can be a phase characterized by being very uncertain about the future, limited access to healthcare, and in some instances, individuals can be detained. And finally, we have the phase of survival and adjustment. And again, this is marked by a great uncertainty about the future. So this is when a refugee arrives in the safer country, the host country. And again, it involves surviving being displaced from your home, but you're often at the mercy of external sources to meet your very basic needs. And again, during this phase, individuals and families can have poor access to health and social care. They can have access to difficult living conditions. So for example, it's very well publicized that many of our direct provision centres, the living conditions can be inadequate for individuals. Many can live in poverty, can feel excluded socially. There's a high risk of exploitation. We know in many countries, refugees face issues of racism and discrimination. And again, in many countries, refugees can be quite uncertain about their future and can face protracted legal issues and immigration issues. And again, there's the challenge of adapting to a new culture and language. And also, the danger may still be occurring in their home country, and many refugees will have family and friends who are still living in those conditions. And then there can be a lot of loss, which I'll talk about in a bit more detail later on. Okay, so I'm just going to talk specifically about the needs of unaccompanied minors now. So that are those who arrive here who are under the age of 18. So we need to think about how war, conflict, persecution might impact on a younger person, but particularly when younger people will be at critical stages of psychological development and the impact that will have then. And also, we know that if a young person is fleeing war, conflict, or traveling or arriving in a new country, there can be a lack of emotional protection, support, and security then from the family and caregivers. We know that young people are at high risk of exploitation. And this can, for many, lead to an overall delay in psychological development. So I'm talking about social development, cognitive development, emotional development. And we know indeed that this can lead to delays in physical growth and development. And ultimately, in terms of relationships, you can understand then why young people who've been through this experience might struggle to trust that adults and indeed systems, the state, can look after them. And so we know from research that it's actually separation from family can have a greater impact on a young person's development and mental health than acts of war itself. So moving on and thinking about outcomes in refugees, and this is a summary of studies both nationally and internationally that looks at rates of mental health problems and comparing them to rates of mental health problems in the general population. And we do know that within either those who are refugees or those who are seeking international protection, that there will be higher levels of things like depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, etc. However, it's important to note that not all refugees will go on to develop significant mental health problems. The majority will actually go on to survive and function well, but a significant minority will require professional help and extra support. Moving on now, and again, this is a way of helping us thinking about the needs of those in a crisis, the needs of those who have faced an emergency, such as those populations who have fled their country of origin because of war and conflict. And it helps to think about those needs in terms of a triangle. And so the bottom of the triangle will be level 1. These are the most basic needs that individuals will need. And this would be basic services, appropriate accommodation, access to food, etc. Above that, we need to think about the needs of the community and families. So for example, access to adequate school, etc. And then following on from that, we need to think about more focused, non-specialized supports that can be provided by, in terms of basic mental health care, public health doctors, etc. And then for that minority that I mentioned, they will require more specialist trauma-focused therapies. So again, this gives us a sense of what the needs are of the majority to set the conditions right to help encourage recovery from these kind of crisis traumatic events. Moving on now, so we're going to think more specifically about how when individuals go through this journey and are exposed to these kind of events, how it can affect them, whether it's war, persecution, or being displaced from the country where you were born. So generally, we see that individuals can be affected in 4 ways. The first being the normal response to a crisis, how we will all respond to a crisis. Then we can look at how overwhelming change can affect those who are trying to make a new home in a host country. We'll talk a little bit about trauma and also about resilience as well. So I'll talk about each one of these in turn. Okay, so again, what I have here is a diagram outlining the normal ways that we all respond to a crisis or when things change in a very overwhelming way. And I'll talk about each one of these in turn, but it can actually help us to imagine how we may have responded to a crisis in our lives. So we can, for example, we can just think back to March 2020 and to think about what it was like when we knew that the coronavirus was coming to Ireland and how we felt at that time. So if we think about the physical ways that's normal to respond in a crisis situation, there are a number of long and short-term effects, and these can affect our health and well-being. So we know that during a crisis, we can experience muscle tension, aches and pains. Our breathing can become faster. We may feel nauseated or dizzy. We can experience constipation or diarrhea. We may experience chest pain or rapid heartbeat. We can experience a lack of sleep, a loss of appetite. We can experience tiredness or hyperactivity. We can experience other physical health issues such as headache or indeed blurred vision. And again, it's important to note that our bodies have evolved over many thousands and thousands of years to respond this way in a crisis. So these are normal responses of our body trying to deal with danger. During a crisis, our thinking and how we process information can change. And as a result, we can experience problems recalling things immediately because we struggle with aspects of our short-term memory. And this is because when we are in crisis, emergency mode, our minds can struggle to pay attention and to concentrate on material. And we can also feel and experience disorientation, particularly relevant to those who are arriving here from different countries seeking our protection. There can be a challenge with processing and understanding language and new language, and that's something we need to take into account. If we think about behavior then of how we may respond in the crisis, some of us may take more risks, or we may start or increase ways of coping that may be unhealthy. It can increase our levels of emotional reactions around others. We may get angry quicker. We may struggle, and again, this is related to how our thinking changes. We may struggle with planning and following through on tasks. It can also lead to a reduction in our energy and activity levels, or the opposite. We can become quite overactive. Substance abuse can become an issue. We may experience sleep problems, and again, it can affect our appetite as well, either increased or decreased appetite. And of course, whenever we experience a crisis, it can affect how we feel. And it's important to note that there's no correct way to feel during a crisis. So we may feel anxiety, worry, fear. Our moods may change. We may be irritable, even more angry. We may feel defensive or doubtful of ourselves or others. We may at times feel overwhelmed, lonely, isolated. We may feel agitated and we can't relax. We may feel sad or hopeless. We may feel depressed or indecisive and worthless. And we may feel guilt. And we may indeed feel all of these things at different times during a crisis. They're all normal, all human. And finally, when we experience a crisis, it can affect how we relate to others. And there's a useful quote here from Judith Herman, who writes that the core experiences of psychological trauma are disempowerment and disconnection from others. So when we experience a crisis, and this is understandable, that we may lack trust in those in authority, whether it's the state or different bodies. And this is something we need to keep in mind if we are working with others who've been through a crisis, that they may struggle with trusting us initially. It may lead to increased levels of arguments and conflict, either within families, between individuals, or indeed with services. And again, individuals who've been through and families who've been through a crisis, because the resources are so taxed, they may become quite dependent on others for decisions and support. And because we want to help, sometimes we can keep that dependence going. Or indeed, we may see the opposite. We may see individuals and families avoiding services, avoiding help and withdrawing. Okay, so I'm just going to talk specifically about the needs of children now and how change and crisis can affect younger people. So again, this will depend on the age of the child and what particular developmental stage they are at. So whether this is occurring in younger childhood or indeed during adolescence. We know if a child is being on a journey such as this, there may have been significant disruption to their education, which may have also disrupted friendships, socializing, etc. And again, it's important if we know whether or not the child is separated from caregivers. And again, common problems we might see with young people who've been through a crisis is separation anxiety. We may see bedwetting, repetitive play. There may be lots of agitation, difficulty with concentration and attention. There may be issues with getting angry, irritable, even aggressive, or the younger person may be withdrawn or quite inhibited. And also, families who go through a crisis, it may impact on how they parent. So it's understandable that a parent may be quite overprotective of children, or indeed may do the opposite and be quite submissive. And again, it's about trying to understand how is the parent understanding with all and coping with all of this change and trauma in their lives. Okay, so again, when we think about the refugee journey, we need to think about the core issue of loss and all of the things that individual and family have lost by leaving the home where they were born and trying to make a new home for themselves here in Ireland. So it will involve loss of their community and their social networks, perhaps some life projects they were involved in, their business. They may have lost their source of income, their structure and activity in their lives, their meaningful social roles, and ultimately, refugees will have lost power and control over their own lives. Moving on now, I'm just going to talk a little bit about trauma. So again, it's very normal and understandable for people who have experienced extreme life stressors to experience varying degrees of distress afterwards. So trauma is when something very serious and upsetting happens and people believe that they could die or be badly hurt. They may have experienced it firsthand or may have witnessed it or even heard about it. And it can happen to adults or children, and it may have happened once or it could be repeated. And these are examples of different kinds of traumas that we may experience in our lives, whether it's a natural disaster, a really bad accident, being physically assaulted, a car crash, a robbery, a loved one who was murdered, sexual assault, rape, war, conflict, witnessing violence, or experiencing torture. And so this shows the normal responses that all humans will respond to a very traumatic life event. And these are normal ways that we will respond afterwards. So afterwards, we may relive that traumatic event. So we may think about it in our minds, and the memories of the event might be very clear as if we're watching a video in our minds, or it may come back to us in bad nightmares at night, or different things may happen to us that may remind us of the event, and it comes back very suddenly and very realistically in our minds. And again, in terms of fight flight, this is how our bodies have developed and evolved over many thousands of years to deal with danger. And it makes sense then that our bodies will stay in this emergency mode to try and keep ourselves safe in case the traumatic event happens again. And with avoidance, this is how we all have it within us, an inbuilt mechanism to stay away from things that might hurt us. And so we may try to avoid thinking about the trauma or talking about it. And this can actually keep the problem going. It can change how we look at the world. So we may begin to see the world as a dangerous place, or that we can't trust other people, or that there's something fundamentally wrong with us. And again, it can change how we feel. We can become depressed or angry, or we can feel many, many things and feel stronger emotions, or we can feel nothing at all and become quite numb. So it's important to remember with trauma that these are normal reactions, and it's the events themselves that are abnormal. It's not normal to experience war, conflict, to have to leave your home because of war and conflict and violence. But your reaction, people's reaction to these things are normal. And it's also important to note that most survivors will show immediate reactions, yet these will typically resolve over time and given the right conditions and as people's basic needs are met. And for a small, significant minority of people, the recovery will be slower and they may need appropriate professional help to overcome what has happened to them. So I'm just going to talk a little bit now about strength and resilience, because sometimes we may overlook that in individuals who have been displaced from their homes. And so resilience is the process of adapting well in the face of significant stress and trauma. So this might be about holding on to parts of yourself that are not changed by the trauma, or indeed developing new parts to yourself. So the sources of resilience and support in people's lives may be personal. It may be a characteristic of yourself. It may be to do with a relationship you have or your ability to form relationships. It may be part of your culture or indeed your spiritual needs as well. And again, we need to think about this idea of how people can preserve their dignity and the strength it can actually take to leave your country of origin, and how that involves resisting power, and that resistance can be a real strength for people now. And finally, many people can develop from traumatic events by growing afterwards as well and developing new qualities about themselves. Okay, so thank you. I will now pass you back to my colleague, Clare Gormley.
Hello, Will. Thanks very much. And I suppose just after all that conversation, we could practice our tension down exercise, just putting our feet firmly on the floor and inhaling, picking up any tension, and exhaling, saying tension down, and picture that tension flowing down and away from us. So thanks very much. I'm just going to share the screen now and continue with the workshop. Hopefully this is visible to you all now. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how to support others using psychological first aid principles. So in terms of helping yourself and helping others, I think before we even start to look after others, it's important to help ourselves, and we'll come to that in the next session. But just to give you the idea of the principles of psychological first aid will also be important then for looking after yourself. So I suppose it's, we've often heard, if we've been on a flight, the flight attendant saying, you know, for anyone who's dependent people or children with them, to put on your own oxygen mask first. So it is important to look after yourself. But we're going to talk here about looking after others and then good information and where to get further help. So psychological first aid, it's the title of our presentation, but what exactly do we mean by that? Psychological first aid is a way of helping people who are in a crisis. And the World Health Organization advises that we use psychological first aid, which is, we'll sometimes call it PFA, to help people in a crisis. And it's simply a way of reaching out to help people with their practical needs and their feelings, their psychosocial needs at the time of a crisis. And while internationally they haven't done randomized control trials or sort of evidence-based research on whether this works in the tightest way possible. This is because it's often been used in natural disasters and so on. So internationally, the evidence is there that this is a very strong, good practice for use in lots of different situations, including the pandemic, and now, of course, including the issues that are facing the people coming in from war in Ukraine or other countries. So why would we want to try to look out for others? So we do know that not everyone who experiences a crisis needs or wants you to help. So if you think of yourself, for example, in the aftermath of a bereavement, you certainly will welcome people coming and sympathizing and supporting us, speaking warmly and kindly to us. But we may not want people to be going further than that at the time. So there's a lot of issues which are about people's own choices at the time. But we do know that people do better over the long term if they feel safe, if they feel connected to others, calm and hopeful, if they can get access to social, physical, and emotional help. And particularly if they can get a sense of control by being able to help themselves. And psychological first aid entails all of these different aspects in a very simple but elegant way. So if someone does want to talk, if you're checking in with people and they do want to talk, there are 4 key goals. Firstly, you want to let the person know that you see and understand that they are distressed. You want to help the person to see that their reactions are normal in a crisis, and to help settle the person down by listening calmly, with patience and with warmth. And then try to help the person with anything practical that they need, or tell them where they can get help. These are, as you can see, are very basic approaches to just dealing with someone, whether you're in a contact center for people, whether you're in a hotel, whether you're working with somebody that you've been allocated to. There are very practical goals. And just remember that you don't have to be able to sort out all of the problems for someone. You're going to do a lot for them by just showing them that you're there, paying attention and caring about their needs at the time. So what psychological aid, first aid is not. It's not something that only professionals can do. It's not about pressurizing people to tell you about their distressing experience, because as I said earlier, that could be something that they're just not ready for at that point in time, and it may do more harm than good. But it is showing them you're available to listen. And people will share with you only what they find comfortable to share at that particular point in time. So it's important to respect that. So 3 key concepts in psychological first aid are to look, to listen, and to link. So it's about, first of all, trying to notice if you're working in a center or hotel or a service or whatever, and you notice somebody particularly distressed, just try to notice that and pick that up. And then give them the opportunity to say something by inviting them to say something, and listen carefully and try to understand. And then see if you can actually do something practical to help them. It could be as simple as getting them a cup of tea or helping them charge their phone battery or whatever, or see if there are others that can help if they have greater needs. So just looking a little bit more detail at our 3 concepts: look, listen, and link. So when you're looking at a situation, you want to check, is there safety? You want to observe if there are people with urgent, basic, or practical needs that really need immediate attention. And observe for people who appear to be in acute distress. They might be the people that you might try to give your attention to first. Then in terms of listening to people, make contact with the people who may need support, ask them what they need, and listen calmly and attentively. And then to link with people. So you're going to help people address their basic needs and access services. You're going to try to help them cope with problems, also using their inner resources and their own ways of dealing with things. You might be able to give information, and certainly try to connect people with loved ones or social supports where you can. So noticing if people seem distressed, the World Health Organization has said, try asking, how are you? And follow it up again. Ask twice, in other words. So in Ireland, if we say to somebody, you know, are you okay? Most people are going to say, yes, I'm fine, even when they are not. So you might need to ask them a second time how they're doing, so that they might really know that you're interested to hear what they have to say, if they want to talk, that is. And bear in mind that not everyone will want to talk things out, and that's absolutely fine too. At least they've got a very clear message from you that you wish to help. And that simple thing can be very restoring and healing for people as well. So let's just look a little bit more detail at a kind of a pathway. It can go in any order. It's not a specific pathway, but through psychological first aid. So we're going to look at providing basic needs for people. Remember the pyramid that Will was talking about. So people need their shelter, their food. You need to help keep people safe. That's so important. And then offer any practical care and support without intruding. Listen and don't pressurize people to talk, as I've said earlier. Try to then ensure, if you're listening to people, that there's privacy and that you don't disclose people's information without their consent to others. But help people to feel calm and hopeful. Encourage them to do the things that have helped them stay calm before. If somebody likes listening to music or taking a walk in nature or something other, see if they can be facilitated to do those things. That might be the best thing you can do at that time. And help people regain control of their lives and involve them in decisions. So important, that piece we were talking about being out of control, as Will was saying, about not having control. So important that people become involved again in their own decisions in their lives. Encourage people to get into good routines. Can't stress that sufficiently, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but good routines of sleeping, eating, good self-care and exercise is the foundation for feeling well and our well-being. So help to connect people with reliable information. There's so much information out there, some of it reliable and some less so, but reliable sources of information, reliable services and supports that you can rely on. And encourage people to keep in touch with friends and family, because we know that's so important for everyone's well-being. And it's so difficult for people if they've friends and family left behind in their country of origin they've come from. But encourage them where they can to do that. So one thing we're aware of is that one of the things that we do with this fantastic brain that we all have is that we think ahead. We think ahead of what might happen and what isn't happening and so on. We worry about the future is very common. And a lot of people you may be encountering will be very worried, not just about what has happened in the past, how things are in the present, but also about the future. And what we'd advise is try to help focus your attention on what is happening in the present, here and now. That's a way to be mindful. You've often heard that word probably, but it's bringing your mind back to the present moment. And if you're working with someone and you feel you're very distressed, what if, try to help them bring back to the moment. In this moment, you're safe. In this moment, you're doing the best you can. That's being mindful. Essentially, what we're trying to do with psychological first aid or any approach to people to try to offer them support is to help soothe them down from the sense of threat or the sense of effort that they might need to be doing things, to try to help them soothe themselves and to offer something that's soothing to them. So some key psychological first aid do's and don'ts, particularly for children and teens. So we would advise that parents shouldn't play 24-hour news channel coverage of the conflict, but rather than that, try to decide when is there a reliable news slot that adults can then decide if they feel it's appropriate to relay to children or to adolescents. If you're working with a child or if you're engaging with a child, you don't need to ask them to keep retelling traumatic events, but rather be prepared to listen if they do want to tell something. So you're not trying to bring a child into talking about issues unless they're volunteering that. And then, as I said earlier, the importance of good routines and play to help parents to help themselves, to help their children. So as I said, encouraging them to put on their own oxygen mask first. If we can help parents be settled and be as comfortable as possible, then by looking after themselves, they're going to be more emotionally available for their children or their dependents. And that's so essential because that's where the child or the dependent person will be looking to the parent or carer for their support. So when you can encourage the parents to be smiling and cooing at babies even, that's so important for a young child's development or an infant's development. So we want to encourage that as much as possible. But as we start to address the issues of other people and their crisis and their distress, we have to look after ourselves, as I said at the start. So how do we go about doing that? I suppose at this stage, in terms of the Ukrainian war and the nationals who are coming from Ukraine into the country, there's a rush among services to kind of surge to action, if you like. There's a feeling of maybe being, strongly bonded with colleagues, rising to the challenge and responding and so on. The focus on getting things done, however, might lead to poor communication, and people might be working in silos, and there's an effort to try and get everything to be connected up. And one of the risks for staff at this stage, in this very active stage, is that going at full tilt can lead to exhaustion. We have to watch out for that. This is going to be a marathon and not a sprint. We have to pace ourselves. It's so important. And then self-neglect. Staff themselves can be neglecting their own needs while they try to reach out and care for others, but that is not sustainable in the long term. So that's something we want to avoid. At times then, if people are overwhelmed talking to person after person, they can be at risk of compassion fatigue and life-work balances, and the cumulative effect of stress building up for ourselves. And our clients might feel resentment, hostility, loneliness, or even feeling a sense of abandonment. So what's our advice to staff? Feelings of incompetence in working in large numbers in crisis is normal. Feelings of guilt are normal. So define and be clear about your role with clear limits. It might stop later disappointment. Try to work in a team and connect with other staff. Do you feel ready or able for helping with this kind of crisis? And can you sustain this in the long term? As I said, it'll be a marathon and not a sprint. So some key self-care messages is to know your warning signs, attend to basic needs, and ensure rest, breaks, and sleep. Take care of your body, physical exercise, and try to avoid unhelpful coping strategies like tobacco, alcohol, drugs, and so on. Remember it's a challenging situation and pace yourself. Feeling stressed isn't a reflection we can't do our jobs, even though sometimes we might feel that way. And managing our emotions is just as important as managing our physical health. Like psychological first aid, we want to encourage ourselves to use the strategies that have worked for ourselves in the past. Stay in touch ourselves with family and friends, and also be prepared to reach out for support if you feel you need it. So use your own inner resources and just take a moment to reflect on, what do I do to take care of myself? How do I keep myself grounded in times of stress? And what do I need to support myself during a prolonged period of increased demands on me? Sorry, that last slide, I'll not pop back to because we're getting tight for time, but just to use, if you've made a self-care plan, write it down, pop it in your a notepad, pop it in your mobile phone or whatever. At the end of the day, self-care is all about getting good balance for yourself. So look after yourselves while you look after others. Just breathing in again, picking up any tension, and exhaling again. Remember, you can do this small exercise really quickly at any time. So where to go for further supports? This is a lovely little graphic from Charles McKeesy's book, which we'd recommend for anyone, and the NHS used it. But for lots of people who are good at giving care, I want you to think about it. What's the hardest word you've ever said? Asked the boy. Help, said the horse. So it can be hard to ask for help for ourselves, and equally it's hard for the people coming into this country to ask for help for themselves. A reliable link is the HSE website and links, and this is it in Ukrainian and Russian as well. And I'd really emphasize yourmentalhealth.ie, which has a lot of strong information and lots of self-help materials as well, and will guide people towards a lot of services that are available for them. We're going to provide these links at the end in a resource for everyone. There was a question earlier about that. So these links will all go out to anyone who's participated. Some of them refugee-specific resources, webinars, and so on. And we'd recommend these apps both for yourselves or for any of the population that are coming in that have got English, but Happify, Calm, Headspace, and Smiling Mind and Your Mental Health. Those apps on your phone can be really helpful to use at different points throughout the day as you need them. And we've designed a course ourselves in Galway, Mayo, and Roscommon, which was initially designed for healthcare staff, but some of the ideas that we've referenced in this workshop are developed in those 5 short 15 to 20-minute talks with 10 minutes of introduction to mindfulness and relaxation, geared towards staff who are working in a situation where there's often crisis. We think it's applicable for all of the different services and groups that are on this workshop as well. So if you need further help yourself, do consider speaking to your employer or your employee support person. And do remember that the GP is a really important primary care port of call for yourself or for any of the people that you encounter as you're trying to support them. So we finished now. I'd like to thank you all very much for participating. Thanks very much to Integrated Media, who supported the workshop and provided hosting for these webinars. It's been really invaluable. And also thanks to Dr. Toby Sashamar, Senior Psychologist with the HSE, who made earlier contributions, as well as work from the Psychological Society of Ireland. So thanks, everybody. And I think I'm joined again by Will. And I suppose just in terms of closing out on our workshop today, if we've received questions that we haven't had a chance to respond to yet, we can do that in our resources that we'll send out. But there is going to be a short survey for the workshop today, and we're very happy to receive any feedback or suggestions for future webinars that might be helpful for your particular service or population that you're working with. So please do take the few minutes to complete the survey. So I don't know, Will, is there anything you want to add to our closing here?
Just to say thank you for everyone for signing in today, and just again, yeah, thanks to IMS for their professional hosting of us today. And yeah, we just hope that this is helpful, and we will be sending resources, and please do share those resources with others. We're happy to share our resources, so pass them on to others. We'll also have a link to a video of this recording as well, so please share that with others. So and I suppose the aim here is that we're all really trying to help each other during this current crisis.
Yeah. So thanks so much. As Will said, there will be a recording, and you'll be able to access that and share that with others. And the links, we'll continue to add to those links and share them with you as well. So once again, we want to wish you well in your work in supporting all the people coming into this country from all the different countries, particularly obviously Ukraine at this point in time. Our hearts are with them. But please look after yourselves while you look after others. Look, listen, and link. Thank you very much indeed, and goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.